The financial sector is a sphere where constant tension reigns, especially when the company's financial success depends on the decisions made. In just one day, you can hit the jackpot or lose everything, ending up in debt or even jobless. But the worst is when such circumstances break a person, and they are ready to do something terrible. Today we will talk about one such case, when the world of the main character fell to pieces, and he took more than a dozen lives with him to the grave. Mark Barton was born in April 1955 in Stockbridge, Georgia, USA, into a military family. Mark's childhood was spent in constant moves across the country with his parents. Already in his quite mature teenage years, his family moved to South Carolina. It was then that his parents' marriage began to fall apart, as his mother was not happy with the need to frequently change their place of residence. She filed for divorce and continued to raise her son on her own, although he did not sever ties with his father, who did not want to completely break off the relationship. From an early age, Mark was a withdrawn boy who seemed emotionally detached and had difficulty communicating with other children. Perhaps it was this, or maybe just ordinary teenage curiosity that pushed the adolescent to experiment with illegal substances. This happened during the heyday and formation of the hippie subculture with all its consequences. Mark quickly got hooked on and was even caught red-handed several times during thefts from pharmacies, but this did not have serious consequences. Despite everything, young Mark managed to enter college. He became a student at Clemson University, where he earned a degree in chemistry. But even in his student years, the young man continued to struggle with his addiction. Already after graduation, he was arrested again for theft, the purpose of which was to get money for another dose. This incident occurred just a month after Mark received his diploma. It was only by a miracle that he managed to avoid problems with his studies, because if he were still a student, he would definitely have been expelled. But even after that, fate continued to smile upon Mark, allowing him to get out of trouble unscathed, regardless of the severity of his misdeeds and mistakes. Although it was obvious that this could not go on forever. All these events took place at the height of the psychedelic boom of the 1960s in the United States, when the use of illegal substances became widespread. The hero of this story was no exception. Having the appropriate education, knowledge, and enthusiasm, Mark decided to try manufacturing illegal on his own. This led to several cases of overdose during experiments, due to which he ended up in the hospital. But each time, the young man's life was saved. Many people thought that Mark had several personalities living inside him. One of them was a diligent straight-A student who brilliantly graduated from university with a degree in chemistry. The other was an addicted person with mental health issues. By 1979, Mark, although he had a solid knowledge in his field of science, was still continuing his battle with his passion for It was then that he moved to Georgia, where fate brought him together with his future wife, Deborah Spivey. Their relationship developed rapidly, and soon the couple got married. At first, Mark got a job, and then his employer sent him to Alabama, where the hero of the story got a position as co-manager of a company specializing in chemical production. But due to his already known problems, Mark lost this job quite quickly. During that period, the young man's psychological state began to deteriorate rapidly. As Deborah confessed, she repeatedly witnessed paranoid outbursts, a kind of breakdowns in her husband's behavior. He constantly feared that someone wanted to kill him, was overly nervous, and behaved strangely. Mark was convinced that he was being watched and eavesdropped on, but despite everything, Deborah loved her husband and sought to support him in every possible way. Over the years of married life, the couple had 2 children, a son, Matthew, and a daughter, Michelle. But over time, the atmosphere in the house began to change for the worse. Against the backdrop of Mark's deteriorating mental health, he increasingly demonstrated manipulative and controlling character traits, especially in his attitude towards his wife. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, and the woman began to fear that her husband could pose a danger to both herself and the children. Deborah repeatedly shared with her loved ones that Mark had begun to look at her with a kind of eerie gaze that frightened the woman. Against this backdrop, the man was fired from his job once again due to complaints from colleagues about his inappropriate behavior. As far as Deborah knew, during that period, Mark continued to use illegal substances. An interesting incident occurred literally the day after being fired from the company. It turned out that someone had hacked into the corporate computers and stolen a large amount of valuable information. Of course, Mark denied any involvement in this incident. However, the investigation quickly got on his trail and proved that he was the one responsible for breaking into the databases. The hero of the story was even arrested, but unexpectedly, the company dropped most of the charges against him. So at first, he was released, and then given a short prison term. It later emerged that Mark had been illegally manufacturing a certain chemical and selling it. At the same time, he was one of the founders of this organization, so the company decided not to tarnish its reputation by drawing attention to such an incident. Thanks to this, Mark managed to get off almost scot-free, as records of his criminal activity simply disappeared. The employers told the police that the conflict had been peacefully resolved after the scandal, which they managed to hush up. Later, the family, along with the children, moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Mark quickly managed to find a prestigious position in a manufacturing company, which, by tradition, was also related to the chemical industry. In addition, he began working as a sales representative for chemicals in another organization. During that period, Deborah told her loved ones that Mark's condition had significantly improved. She felt positive emotions about their marriage, and believed that they had managed to save the relationship. This was important to her, as the mother did not want to traumatize the children with their parents' divorce. At that time, Mark became calmer and even seemed to have stopped using. However, there were more mundane reasons behind this. Once at work, he met a girl named Leanne Lynx, who was only 20 years old at the time. She got a job as a secretary at the company where Mark was a dealer. Sparks immediately flew between them, which later grew into a stormy romance. The hero of the story fell head over heels in love with the girl. Their secret relationship lasted quite a long time. By 1993, it might have seemed that there were no problems at all in Mark's life. He looked great, played sports, earned a decent income, stopped using. He had a loving wife, wonderful children, and even a mistress. Everything seemed cloudless until Deborah began to suspect her husband of marital infidelity. At first, she tried to reassure herself with the thought that Mark was going through a midlife crisis, as he had indeed begun to take better care of himself and even look younger. However, more disturbing thoughts about her husband's unfaithfulness also crept into the woman's mind. The hero of the story assured that he had no mistresses, and that he simply wanted to prolong his youth in this way. In early 1993, Mark purchased a life insurance policy for his wife in the amount of $600,000. It later turned out that he even tried to arrange an even more expensive policy for $1 million but could not gather enough funds to pay for such high insurance. In June 1993, Leanne and Mark went on a trip together. He traveled with his mistress for several days, explaining to his wife that it was a business visit to a neighboring state. During this trip, Mark confessed his love to the girl. He was ready to do anything to be with her. He even planned to leave his wife and marry Leanne. The girl agreed, but on the condition that the man must first divorce. However, contrary to expectations, the wife did not agree to the divorce. Even by the end of the summer of 1993, she continued to refuse. All this threatened to turn into a large-scale divorce process that could drag on for a year or more, given the number of controversial issues. At that time, the couple was working with a lawyer on family matters. As expected, the process was delayed, as it was necessary to draw up plans for custody of the children, their upbringing, and also resolve the issue of alimony. All this required time, especially since the couple had serious disagreements on many issues. In early September 1993, Deborah decided to go on a weekend trip to the lake with her mother and family. Everyone knew that the couple was going through a crisis. However, people believed that they were holding on and trying to solve all their problems. Life went on as usual. Deborah invited her husband to join the trip and wanted to take the children with her. But the daughter fell ill, and the son Matthew, who was a Boy Scout, had to go on an important hike on the same weekend. Mark told his wife that he would stay at home with the children. He suggested that the woman go to the lake with her mother, and the two of them would spend time together. Deborah agreed to her husband's proposal and did not refuse her plans, going to the lake. Her mother was supposed to join her there. The last time both women were seen was on the evening of September 4, 1993. There was no sign of trouble, everything seemed calm and ordinary. But on Monday, something unexpected happened. The women did not return home at the appointed time. Deborah's father tried to contact his daughter and wife, but all attempts were in vain. They simply ignored the calls. Mark also said that he knew nothing about their whereabouts. Eventually, Deborah's father went to the police to request a welfare check and provided the address of the house by the lake. When they arrived at the scene, the police received no response to their knocking on the door. A few minutes passed, the officers walked around the area but noticed nothing suspicious. The only thing that caught their attention was the cars parked in the driveway. It seemed that the owners had not gone anywhere and should be either in the house or somewhere nearby. However, no trace of either woman was found. The police noticed a trailer on the property that appeared to be unlocked. Deciding to go inside, they saw a horrific sight. 36-year-old Deborah and her 59-year-old mother Loisa had been brutally beaten to death. The killer was no longer at the crime scene. Judging by everything, the perpetrator had used an axe or a bat. The entire trailer was covered in blood inside. The attack had occurred with extreme cruelty. The women simply had no chance of survival. Chaos reigned all around, clearly indicating a struggle or a search for valuables. The strange thing was that nothing was missing. The only thing the criminal took was Deborah's wedding ring. All other valuables, such as the gun on the kitchen counter and a few $100s in cash in the victim's bags, remained untouched. No signs of a break-in were found. It seemed that the victims were familiar with their abuser. It is quite possible that they were careless and did not lock the doors, which allowed the killer to burst inside unhindered. For the police, Mark Barton immediately became the main suspect. He had a financial motive, the insurance. In addition, he was clearly not happy about the upcoming problems associated with the divorce, alimony, and issues of child custody. It was obvious that Deborah had enough leverage to turn the situation in her favor. So it was most profitable for him to get rid of his wife, taking advantage of the opportunity to kill her in a remote area without witnesses. Unfortunately, there were not even surveillance cameras at the crime scene. Immediately after the funeral, the police went to search Mark's house, but nothing incriminating was found, except for his wife's life insurance policy. The investigators were also interested in the main suspect's car. There they managed to find a few drops of blood on the steering wheel and the ignition lock. The man explained their appearance by a recent deep cut on his finger. Unfortunately, the blood samples were not suitable for analysis. It was not even possible to establish whether they belonged to a person, since all the stains were doused with a carbonated drink and spoiled. It remained a mystery how Mark managed to spill an almost sticky sweet drink all over the interior. But he attributed everything to chance. In any case, this interfered with a full-fledged analysis of the samples. Therefore, the hero of the story was released after interrogation. Several witnesses who were with Mark and his son on the hike said that he had left for a few hours and was absent. This time would have been enough to carry out the massacre. In fact, the man had no unassailable alibi. Nevertheless, after some time, the case was closed. Deborah's relatives were shocked that the couple's children, Michelle and Matthew, were left without a mother, and the perpetrator was never punished. The detectives just threw up their hands. Almost immediately after the double murder, people around began to notice oddities in Mark Barton's behavior. A week after he became a widower, his mistress Lee and moved into the house. She began to behave like a mistress and even tried to become a mother to Mark's children. After the case was closed, Mark received an insurance payout for his wife's death, but not in full, only half, $294,000. He was dissatisfied with the amount and sued the insurance company. As a result, the payout was increased to $450,000. At the same time, $150,000 of this was transferred to a trust fund for the children. The man told everyone that he was crazy about his new mistress, that he had never loved anyone like that before. So it came as no surprise to anyone when he and Lee got married soon after. Now Mark had enough money for various experiments. Therefore, he decided to quit his job and start a new business. He became a trader in a brokerage firm. It is also known that during that period he actively played gambling. Some time after his wife's death, the man's emotional state deteriorated. Trading, which at first seemed like a profitable business, began to bring losses. Mark made one mistake after another, having neither the appropriate financial education nor experience. At the same time, he put large sums at stake, which he lost one after another. As a result, by June 1999, he had not only squandered his entire fortune but also had debts of $105,000 for securities that he was entrusted with in the company where he worked. All this was the result of numerous unsuccessful deals that he made during that period. Eventually, Mark lost his trading license. He was fired, but he was not going to give up. The man got a job in another company, Momentum Securities, where he was also engaged in trading technology investments in the stock markets. The office of this firm was located right across the street from Mark's previous place of work. No one even suspected that at that time he was experiencing the peak of his struggle with mental problems. Difficulties began again. Instead of profits, the hero of the story began to bring losses. Therefore, he was fired for the second time. On July 29, 1999, Mark came to the office of his former employer, Momentum Securities, in Atlanta. Once inside, he chatted with several former colleagues who recognized him. They did not notice anything suspicious. Later, these people said that Mark's behavior after this innocent conversation shocked them. He said, "I hope this doesn't ruin your trading day," and then he suddenly pulled out 2 pistols and opened fire. 4 people died instantly. Before fleeing the office, Mark tried to kill his former boss and mentor, Brad Schumacher, shooting him 3 times. It seemed that Mark and Brad Schumacher had a rather respectful professional relationship. But apparently, Mark himself had a different opinion on this matter. Fortunately, Brad survived the triple shot. It became clear that this was not a chaotic act of aggression. Mark knew exactly where he was going. He purposefully arrived at the office of the company from which he had been fired for embezzlement and where he had previously worked. But Mark did not stop there. Further, in his plans, there was a continuation of the bloody massacre in the neighboring building, where he had also once worked and from where he had been fired. Taking advantage of the general panic and fuss, he calmly crossed the street. As soon as he entered the hall, he came across an office manager named Kevin Young. Without saying a word to him, Mark simply aimed his gun at him and shot him in the chest. The man died on the spot. Shooting started here too, during which Mark shot 3 traders. Mass hysteria ensued. People in a panic tried to save their lives by running away. When the list of the shooter's victims grew by 5 more people, he headed to the conference room and began shooting the employees who were there. The first wounded was the company's co-founder, the same man who had once personally hired Mark. By the time the police surrounded the building, the hero of the story was long gone. Somehow Mark managed to escape. But one of the witnesses noticed how he, breaking through the crowd, got into a green minivan and disappeared. This person managed to remember the car's license plate number. He passed this information on to the police officers who arrived at the scene. Thanks to this, law enforcement officers were able to establish the identity of the suspect by running the car through the database. Unfortunately, it was not possible to locate the criminal immediately. He disappeared in an unknown direction, and attempts to track the car did not bring any results. Therefore, law enforcement agencies were forced to turn to the media. In order to report what had happened, it was necessary to bring the information to the general public and involve any potential witnesses in the case. At the very least, it was necessary to warn people that an armed and extremely dangerous criminal was at large. Messages from citizens began to arrive at the police station within the first 30 minutes. One of the gas station employees saw Mark stop there in his car. He filled up a full tank and drove away. 4 hours later, a girl turned to the police department. She said that some stranger had attacked her on the street. He aimed a weapon at her and threatened her. Fortunately, the girl managed to escape from the criminal. She was frightened to death when she saw on TV the photograph of the man who had carried out the mass shooting and recognized her attacker in him. The police assumed that Mark probably wanted to take a hostage in order to escape. Thanks to the girl's appeal, it was possible to establish the approximate direction of the criminal's movement, and a large-scale pursuit began, which ended quite quickly. Mark was cornered and surrounded. When the police with weapons began to surround the car, a shot rang out. The 44-year-old main character of this story, realizing that his escape plan had failed and that he would not be able to avoid arrest, shot himself in the head. He simply put a bullet in his temple, thus evading justice. Now the investigation had to find out what exactly happened and what made this man take up arms. Detectives came to the house where Mark lived, aiming to talk to his second wife. But they could not get in touch with her. Therefore, suspicions arose that she could have fled. The investigators had reason to believe that the wife could have been an accomplice to her criminal husband. Law enforcement officers were looking for any clues that could point to this probable accomplice, who may have still been harboring bloody plans. It seemed strange that a well-educated trader just took up arms and started killing. However, what the police found in the house did not at all coincide with their expectations. In the closet of the marital bedroom, they found Lee and beaten to death, and in other rooms of the house, the bodies of Barton's 2 children, Michelle and Matthew. The son and daughter were also brutally beaten to death in their own beds. The children's bodies were covered with sheets up to their necks, and their heads were wrapped in pillows so that only their faces were visible. The murder weapon was also found in the house. The criminal used a bat, which he used to smash the heads of each of his relatives. As forensic experts were able to find out, Mark had dealt with his wife 2 days before he staged the shooting at the trading companies. And the day after her murder, he took the lives of his own children. In the living room, the police found a note printed on a printer explaining the circumstances of the terrible crime. According to this note, on the morning of July 27, 1999, Mark Barton woke up at home and decided that Lee and must die. That's when he carried out his gruesome plan. In the note, Barton claimed that before this, he had arranged an unforgettable weekend for his children, which he regarded as a farewell. What actually happened at those moments is not exactly known. It is quite possible that the children were actually held hostage and had no way to escape. After Mark had beaten all his relatives to death, he left notes on their bodies. Having covered each one with a sheet, he placed symbolic gifts on the chests of his children. A teddy bear and a handwritten note lay on Michelle. A similar letter was on Matthew's body. In addition, the father left a video game on his son's chest. All these notes were dated July 29, 1999, at 6:38 a.m. Mark did not indicate the real reason for his act, apparently believing that no one would understand him. But he explained that he had come to hate life and the whole system of values. This hatred had been gradually growing for several months until he made such a radical decision. The man insisted that he loved everyone who had become his victims. He expressed the hope that he would meet them in heaven. According to him, he tried to kill them as quickly and painlessly as possible. Having made sure that they were dead, Mark decided that it would be too hard for the children without their parents. Therefore, he considered it necessary to take them with him. The note said that he was sure that God would take care of them in the next life. But before going there, Mark intended to take as many lives as possible of those people who, in his subjective opinion, wished him dead. Probably, it was the move to Alabama that became the beginning of the end for him. His first wife, while still alive, told her loved ones that after that move, Mark began to suffer from paranoia. And his work productivity began to drop rapidly. Eventually, this became the reason for his dismissal at the initiative of the employer. Later, Mark was caught sabotaging company data. The management decided not to blow this incident out of proportion. Of course, they could not leave Mark unpunished either. But at the same time, it was not profitable for them to attract too much attention to their newcomer company in the market and discredit it in the eyes of competitors. It all ended with a short term of imprisonment, which Mark served after the incident with the sabotage of company data. But now, when he had squandered all the money and survived several job layoffs, the man seemed to have lost any desire to live. The police immediately noticed the similarity with the murder of Mark's first wife, Deborah Spivey, and her mother, who were just as brutally beaten to death in a trailer. All this time, Mark remained the main suspect in that case. However, he always denied his involvement in the murder of his ex-wife and her mother. Even in his note, he denied his guilt in that crime. Instead, Mark confessed to beating his last wife and 2 children from his previous marriage to death while they were sleeping. He claimed that he did it quickly, smashing their heads with a bat so that they would not feel pain. In the note, Mark described in detail his state before the murder of his relatives. He woke up in the middle of the night, feeling an all-consuming hatred for everything around him. The only salvation from these feelings seemed to him to be death. But the madman did not want to leave this life alone. So he decided to first deal with his closest people, then kill as many of those he considered his abusers as possible, and only after that, take his own life. Mark continued to insist that he loved his children and wife with all his heart, but they still had to die. What exactly made him blame everyone around him for his colossal losses of money in the stock markets remained a mystery. None of the colleagues who worked side by side with Mark could understand the reasons for such frenzied aggression. Moreover, Mark's victims were ordinary office workers who simply performed their routine work. They did nothing to harm him and were in no way to blame for his professional failures and dismissals. And although the man clearly denied his involvement in the double murder of Deborah and her mother, committed in 1993, the police were still convinced of his guilt. This was indicated by several weighty facts. First, a very similar modus operandi of the crime. In both cases, a bat served as the murder weapon. Secondly, only Mark had a serious motive for the massacre. Thirdly, he had access to the lake house and was one of the few who knew that Deborah and her mother were there. After all, outsiders rarely appeared in that area. As it turned out, the neighbors were aware of the constant conflicts and quarrels between Mark and his first wife Deborah. Therefore, they also had no doubt that it was he who killed her. One can only guess what really happened behind the closed doors of the Barton couple's house. A telling incident occurred in February 1994, when Mark's daughter Michelle, who was only 2.5 years old at the time, told the kindergarten that her dad had molested her. It is quite likely that this had happened before and could have been another reason for Mark to get rid of his first wife. After the girl's complaint, an investigation was conducted, but the case did not proceed due to the child's confused testimony and the absence of any evidence. However, now it is impossible to prove Mark's involvement in the death of Deborah and her mother, because the only person who could confess to the crime and reveal all its details has passed away. In the opinion of the authorities, the motive for the murder of the first wife could well have been the insurance compensation that Mark received immediately after her death. He used this money to finance his career as a trader. Mark preferred high-risk investments in IT companies, which ultimately did not meet his expectations. Detectives believe that in his note, Mark was untruthful when he claimed that only death seemed to him the only way out of the situation. And that allegedly, that is why he decided to take his second wife and children with him. After all, after their murder, Mark did not commit suicide but staged a shooting at work, after which he tried to escape. Obviously, he intended to start a new life. And this indicates that initially, Mark was not planning to die but decided on suicide only when he realized that he could end up behind bars, which he was very afraid of. As a result of Mark's bloody actions, 9 of his former colleagues and 3 members of his own family were killed. Another 13 people were injured but were able to survive the attack. At the time of the tragedy, Mark's son and daughter were 8 and 11 years old, respectively, and his young wife Lee Ann had turned 27. Among the victims of the shooting were 7 traders, the youngest of whom had barely turned 30, and the oldest was already 60. In addition, Mark killed a 36-year-old office manager and a 43-year-old computer course student who worked at Alltech Investment Group. Many still believe that Mark Barton's first wife and her mother should also be added to this mournful list. And even in 2024, this terrible massacre remains the largest shooting in terms of the number of victims in the history of the state of Georgia. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Until next time, friends.